In the summer of 2003, I began filming the series Atheism, A Rough History of Disbelief. As part of the process, I talked to a number of writers, scientists, historians, and philosophers. Having secured their cooperation, I was very embarrassed to find that a large proportion of what went on ended up on the cutting room floor, simply because the series would have lasted 24 hours otherwise. Well, as it happens, the BBC agreed with me that the conversations were too interesting to be junked. And with these 6 supplementary programmes, they've made the extremely unusual decision to go back to the original material and to broadcast at length some of the conversations which I had. Conversations with people such as the English biologist Richard Dawkins, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the Cambridge theologian Dennis Turner, the American playwright Arthur Miller, the English philosopher Colin McGinn, and the American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg. Now, the English biologist Richard Dawkins is probably almost as well known as an atheist as he is as a scientist. And it's clear in the conversation we had that the theory of evolution played a very important part in undermining his own religious belief. But as it happens, we met right at the start of the war in Iraq. So before we could get to Darwin, we started by contemplating the role that religion had played in the policies of a Christian British Prime Minister and a Christian American President.
Blair is obviously an order of magnitude more sophisticated intellectually than Bush. That wouldn't be difficult. But I suspect that whereas Bush is just plain naive, they probably both have some sort of an idea that there's a war going on between good and evil. And that, in Bush's case, and in the case of I think many Americans, I suspect that many of them can't tell the difference between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. I mean, that they're all evil. And so that's why it was so easy to switch the American public from a genuine fight against terrorism after September the 11th to a totally irrelevant fight against Iraq, which after all could have happened at any time. But what happened was that September the 11th focused everybody's attention on evil and the fact that there's a them against us. And it then became very easy to muddle up in people's minds anybody evil.
Now, in identifying them as exponents of evil, I believe, and I'm sure you do, that they actually think that evil is a principle of some sort which exists in the universe, a spirit. Now, do you think that that notion of evil as an autonomous principle is inseparably associated with a religious belief in a deity?
Well, I think it's very similar, and I think that there is a sort of impulse in humans to personify and to, instead of just recognizing that evil and good are descriptions we give to things that people do, I mean, good things and bad things. I think there is a tendency to personify and to think that there's a spirit of good, a spirit of evil. That implies some kind of a war between them. You can kill evil by having a war against, in this case, evil people, without realizing that that may very well spawn a whole lot of more people who may not necessarily be evil, but who will simply rise up and do things like terrorist acts as a consequence.
So in other words, in addition to these mortal exponents of wicked deeds, there is, as it were, behind the visible and palpable surface, some sort of metaphysical principle which outlasts.
I think that's what they think. Whether directly, I expect Bush actually thinks that literally, and I think Blair kind of subconsciously thinks it, yes.
So you think that this is being an inevitable consequence of a larger religious belief in the existence of metaphysical principles in the universe?
I'm sure it goes with a larger religious belief, whether it stems directly from that religious belief or whether both of them stem from the same kind of mental predisposition, which I dare say all humans have to some extent. I don't know.
But if, as Richard suggests, all human beings share a predisposition to believe, I wanted to know the extent to which he himself might have experienced belief in his early life. After all, I've been talking to many people who, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, identified themselves as atheists or disbelievers, and I was interested in how people arrived at it, or whether they had had it from the start. I asked Richard whether he started life, as indeed I had, without a religious thought.
No, I had a normal Anglican upbringing. And I think I first started to doubt it when I woke up to the fact that there were lots of different religions and they couldn't all be right. And it was just an accident, an arbitrary accident, that I happened to have been brought up in the Anglican Church. So that caused me to have doubts, and I sort of became a non-believer at the age of about 9 as a result of that. However, I then reverted to religious belief until the age of about 16.
Okay, well, if I can stop you there
Yes.
and say, I'm very interested in these critical moments.
Yes.
What do you think prompted the reversion to something which you had begun to be doubtful about?
I think it was the argument from design. I think I started to appreciate the glorious complexity, especially of life, and didn't at that time understand the Darwinian explanation for it. And so I think that I did the rather naive thing of assuming that if something looks as though it's designed, it probably is designed, and didn't kind of wake up to the alternative explanation until I was about 16. Also didn't wake up to the fact that even without the Darwinian explanation, design is a very bad explanation for the complexity of life, because it's got a regression built into it. I mean, you have to explain the designer, and so it's not even a good explanation. But finally, I was about 16 when I discovered Darwinism and was taught Darwinism, and then realized that there is not just an adequate explanation for the complexity of life, but a wonderful, sort of electrifyingly simple explanation, which is the Darwinian evolution.
Now, did it come as a flash of delight, or was there in fact an agonizing sense of regret and remorse at what you had lost?
I don't remember any regret. I think it was delight, and it was a delighted sense of freedom, perhaps, from a view of the world which was always rather unsatisfactory anyway. And it was also delight at the positive feeling that one now had a fully satisfactory explanation of the way the world was, and that I had my life before me to try to understand that in detail.
All right, now if I can go back to that period between 9 and 15. 9 when you first started to have doubts about it because there were so many religions, and 15 when you had the, as it were, the biological road to Damascus and began to read Darwin. What form did your relatively undoubting religion take? I mean, in the way of observance, in the way of prayer, in one way or another?
Oh, yes. Between 9 and 15, I was pretty devout. I got confirmed. I used to pray. I used to sort of have little fantasies at school, in boarding school, sort of creeping down to the chapel and praying and having sort of visions of angels and things. I remember being prepared for confirmation, which actually, even at the time, I could sort of see that was a load of rubbish. I mean, I sort of forced myself to go on believing in it because here was this vicar in his cassock telling me about it, but it just didn't hang together. It didn't make any sense. I could follow an argument that said the world is such a beautiful place it needs a designer, but that wasn't what it was about at all. It was all about original sin and things like that, which even then I could sort of see wasn't really coherent.
So in a sense then it was more tied to morality and the sense of sinfulness than it was to the beauty of the creation.
I think the preparation for confirmation probably was, yes. Yeah.
I mean, were you constantly told by the minister that you were, in the nature of man, an inheritor of some sin?
I don't remember that. I mean, I do remember odd little stupidities, such as disease is a result of sin. Disease is not a result of bacteria or viruses or cancerous tumours. Disease is a result of sin. And I can remember being told that and hearing other people saying it later on, apparently taking it seriously. I mean, they just didn't sort of seem to realise what an extraordinarily unpleasant as well as illogical thing it is to believe.
So when at the age of 16, you became acquainted with Darwin. Was it because you were taught about Darwin, or you began reading The Origin of Species?
No, it's because I was taught.
And were you taught by people who, as it were aware, or seemed to be aware of the fact that it would have theological consequences?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that wasn't the terms in which they put it, anyway.
How soon in the lessons did you begin to see that it did have theological consequences, that it more or less knocked the idea of design on the head?
I do remember that I understood the principle of Darwinism before I believed it was really big enough to do the job. So I understood the principle of it and realized that, yes, that is a candidate explanation for doing this job, but I still don't think it's a big enough job. And it was only later that I decided, yes, it is a big enough.
Well, in that case, I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask you, for the point of view of the viewers, to... It's an awkward question I'm asking you, to give us a summary of the most persuasive version of Darwinian theory.
Right. First, I would make a distinction between the fact of evolution, the actual change from generation to generation that has led from bacterial ancestors to all the creatures that we have today by gradual change, such that you wouldn't have noticed it in any particular generation. That is a matter of fact which can be observed not directly but by its aftermath in the form of fossils and the pattern of living creatures. Then ask, what is the guiding force that led to it being like that? Natural selection. And the most illuminating way I can think of to explain that is that all living things contain digitally coded representations of themselves, digitally coded instructions for building themselves and for making more like themselves. The instructions survive or they don't survive, depending upon how good the bodies are at surviving and how good the bodies are at reproducing and therefore passing them on. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the world becomes filled with coded instructions for being successful in building bodies that survive and reproduce those very same coded instructions.
Now, the objection that is constantly raised by people who hear this, to me and to you, extremely persuasive argument, they say, aha, but what is the source of these fruitful novelties upon which natural selection exerts its pressures? People would say, well, surely the novelties themselves, even if they are then pressure is exerted upon them, something has to explain the novelties themselves.
Yeah. Well, the novelties themselves, of course, are genetic variations in the gene pool, which ultimately come from mutation and more proximally come from sexual recombination. There's nothing very inventive or ingenious about those novelties. I mean, they are random. And they mostly are deleterious. Most mutations are bad. And so you really need to focus on natural selection as the positive side, and it's only natural selection that produces living things which have the illusion of design. The illusion of design does not come from the novelty. It comes from what happens to the novelty as it is filtered through.
But the argument was constantly levelled about the imperceptible changes which might, in fact, as they were developed and recurred, would have culminated in something as useful as a feather. They constantly emphasised the fact, what was it about that early novelty, before it had accumulated to the point where it was recognisably doing an adaptive job, where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
Yes. Well, it's a fair point, and it's one that I've talked about quite a lot. There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cells saying, look,